Hello interwebs, welcome to Let's Build Computers. Today I'm taking a look at the GameMax Kamikaze Pro chassis. This is a Micro ATX chassis that implements full RGB effects via 4 RGB fans, with 3 at the front and 1 at the rear, all of which are synchronized via the Aurora Sync controller that's built in at the back of the case. The Kamikaze Pro offers fantastic airflow via its full mesh front panel, with no obstructions or tempered glass blocking the way at all, but still providing an excellent view of the RGB fans up front. Additionally, we also have a top vent which is fully filtered as well using a magnetically latching filter, and up here you've got another dual 120 or 140mm fan mounts. Water cooling can also be accommodated via either the top mount or by front mounting behind the RGB fans, with room for up to a 360mm long radiator. Inside the case we find a full-length power supply enclosure with the cutout for 360mm radiators, including two 2.5-inch mounts for SSDs or laptop hard drives, and a nice gap so your power supply can be on show as well. So power supplies with either RGB effects or other screen effects are also clearly visible. On the top mounted front panel of this case, we find a pair of USB 3.0, a pair of USB 2.0 connectors, as well as headphone and microphone jacks. We've also got power and reset buttons. We have an LED button to change the RGB effects at the touch of a finger, and we have a fan speed selector switch so we can change the speed of the internal case fans between high, low, or off. Before you assemble your computer, I generally recommend building up your motherboard first. So fit your CPU and your CPU cooler and drop in your RAM. And then in addition, I also suggest if you're using an M2 SSD like I am, get that guy fitted as well. It's much easier to build up your motherboard while it's not inside the case. And the more you do now, the less you have to do in the case where you're having to start working in more narrow areas. So I'll start by removing both the side panels on the case to give myself full access to... both sides. There's 4 thumb screws around the tempered glass side panel, which I've got to remove, and then we can put this to one side. Tempered glass is pretty tough stuff, but obviously take care of it, because if it does break, you're going to have broken glass everywhere. In the back of the case, we'll find a small bag, usually zip tied to something like this. And this contains all of our extra fittings and screws and anything else you'll need to build inside the case. So keep this guy to one side, you're probably going to need it. Additionally, I'm also going to take off the front panel of the case. And to do this, you want to get your hand underneath the case to grab hold of it and give it a firm pull toward you. And the front panel will just pop off from these 6 points here. So we can put this to one side, and now we also have access to these fans as well. Okay, right, on the back panel of the computer, we've got a lot of wires floating around right now. And all of these, we'll want to try and tuck them back and tie them down neatly so they're not just floating around as a spaghetti mess. However, I recommend doing this a bit later on when you know exactly what you need and what you don't need. And also when you know where the wires are going to go. Doing this in the early game when you're not sure often results in just a lot of wasted cable ties. So the most important thing is that we identify which stuff is going to go to our motherboard. And that is going to be this big bundle coming from the top, minus the 2 cables here that both go straight down to our RGB hub. And these 2 cables connect up the LED switch to modify our RGB effect and the fan switch to modify the fan speed. My front panel cables are going to end up coming up through one of these lower holes down here to go up to the bottom of the motherboard. So I'll just length match those, just poke those up through there for now. And we'll sort those out in a minute. Now I'm going to take my power supply, which is a GameMax RGB power supply. I'm using the 1050 watt version. You won't necessarily need this much power in a standard computer, but this same power supply is also available in a 550 or 850 watt variant as well. So there's a different rating that's suitable for every kind of build. And if you're using a modular power supply like this one, I strongly recommend that you get your modular cables and pick out which ones you're going to need and plug those into the back first, because it can get very, very pokey in these power supply enclosures. So let's grab our selection and decide which ones we're going to need. So we're definitely going to need our ATX power cable. This goes to our motherboard. I'm also going to need a CPU power cable, which on the GameMax power supplies is this guy with the blue connectors. My particular one came with 2 of these, just in case I'm using a high-end motherboard that has multiple CPU connectors for extreme overclocking. But in the vast majority of cases, you're only going to need 1 of them. So we'll put that to one side as well. In terms of drive connectivity, I have a single M.2 SSD going into this build with no hard drives, so I don't actually need any SATA connectors. However, my GameMax chassis that I'm using does have a Molex connector to power the fan controller and the RGB lighting. So I'm going to use the combo chain that I've been supplied with, and this guy has a single Molex connector on it, and it has a couple of SATAs on it as well. So with this guy going into the hard drive bay, not only have I powered up my fan and RGB hub on the case, but also I've got a couple of spare connectors in case I want to connect up a hard drive at a later date as well. And forward thinking can pay off later, so if you're not sure if you need those extra power connectors or not, don't be afraid to connect them up and just have them tucked out of the way and out of sight. Just so later on down the line, if you want to drop in an extra drive, the cables will be there for you to do it. Finally, I'm also going to need one of these PCI Express 8-pin connectors as well to power my graphics card. Now these guys look very similar to that CPU power connector, and the big giveaway for which one is which is the CPU power connector is a 4+4 connector, so it can split in the middle like that. Whereas the PCI Express connector, by comparison, is a 6+2 connector, so 2 of the pins can slide off the side. Like that. And the reason why those splitting connectors exist is that there are some graphics cards that are only 6-pin, some of that are 8-pin, and likewise some lower end motherboards are only a 4-pin connector instead of the 8-pin connector. So set up your connectors as you need them by checking out your graphics card or your motherboard. So now I know what connectors I need, I can plug all of those into the back of my power supply in advance and make sure they're all ready to go on, and then we'll plonk our power supply into the case with all of the connectors pre-wired. I've left a gap between all of my connectors where I can, because it just gives the cables a little bit more space to fold, and it also means that if you do need to get your hand in there to unplug something, there's just a little bit of a gap around the connectors to help you feel out where that pesky plug is that you need to connect or disconnect. Now it's time to get this guy into the case. There's 2 options for a power supply. You can mount it with the fan pointing up or down. Now, having the fan pointed upwards provides the general advantage that it intakes from inside the computer and increases the exhaust airflow of your computer. This also means that you don't need to worry about the power supply sucking up dust from underneath the computer. However, certain cases and power supplies don't favour this setup. For example, the GameMax Kamikaze that I'm using here does not have a vent in the top of the power supply enclosure. Therefore, it's much better suited for the power supply to be fan pointing downwards into this vent instead. And once your power supply is in the case, grab the 4 screws that came in the power supply packet and just screw those guys in. And I recommend starting off with a very loosely fitted screw, and that means that you can just gently nudge the power supply around into position just in case one of the screws is not picking up on its thread. Whereas if you tighten the screw straight away and you find that another screw doesn't want to align, then you have to go around and undo everything again. So loose fit everything first, then give it just a little bit of a wiggle to make sure it's seated nicely, and then go around and tighten your screws. And remember that no screw in a computer needs to be done bone-graunchingly tight. Just take it up to the bite point and just give it a little nip. That's all you need to do. Remember, this thing doesn't need to take a lot of crash and tumbling around. It just needs to be secure. And if you tighten all those screws up, then you're just asking for trouble by either stripping a head, stripping the thread, or both, or just otherwise shearing something off. And it's a bad time when that happens, I can tell you. Now our power supply is in place, we've got some new cables that we need to route around. So I'm going to grab all of these and just generally lay them down vaguely where they need to go. So my drive cable, this guy is only going to go into this enclosure down here. So I'm going to route this guy around the bundle and get him out of my way. And I might have to just thread him through some other cables in order to achieve that. My CPU power cable here, this guy's going to be going to the top left-hand corner of the motherboard, which is all the way up here just off camera. So let's shuffle this guy down a bit, and we're going to take this guy up the side of the case and take him through that little hole there. And I'm just going to lay these cables in place. Later on, we'll tie all these guys down so they're all nice and firmly in position and look a bit more attractive. But for the time being, just loose fit everything in place. Just lay everything vaguely where it needs to go. The big fat ATX cable, this guy is going to go to somewhere in the middle of your motherboard. So we're going to take it through one of these cable management holes here. So let's dive straight through there. And we're not going to need a huge amount of it on the inside, so we'll just put it through to that first fold. That'll do just fine. And then finally, the PCI Express cable. Sometimes you can take these guys up through the bottom, and sometimes they're better suited going through one of these holes. I'll leave that decision up to you. For me, I think I'm just going to leave mine through this lower cable management hole, and we'll sort him out later on. The graphics card is one of the last things to go into the computer, so we've got plenty of time to just sit and leave that one moving around until we figure out where it needs to go. Now I need to run my front panel connectors back through this bottom hole, because I had to move them to get my power supply into position. And that is exactly why we don't tie things down early on, because you never know when you run a cable and suddenly realize that it's really in the way. Right, that's our main stuff fitted. Now we're going to flip this whole thing over and we can actually start putting stuff into the main interior of the case. So I'll start out just by folding some of these cables that we've run back out of the way. Just get these guys out of the way so we've got a nice clear space in the middle. Don't worry if some of them want to fall back in the way, that's okay, we can keep moving them. These front panel connectors are one of the most annoying for that. But once we've cleared it, we'll have a clear and open space for our motherboard to go inside. So, the first part of fitting the motherboard is to get your motherboard's I/O shield, which will come within the motherboard box, and we've got to fit this to the back of the case. So, it will have a beveled edge around it, and that beveled edge goes on the outside, while this shiny, silvery, earthed bit, that goes on the inside. So, we'll line that up, make sure it's the right way up, and stick that just in that back panel down there. Now we need to do a hole check for our motherboard. So I'm going to offer up the motherboard. I'm not worried about these cables being in the way. And I want to check what mounting holes it has. So this board, this is quite a wide board I've got here. We've got the standard 6 holes, here, 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 and here, and here, and here. and then I've got another 2 here and here. So by looking into the case, I can see that we've got our 6 standard ones are already pre-mounted on my case, and I need to add in another 2 into this hole and into this hole. So what I'll do is I'll grab the bag of fittings that came with the case, and we need to get our standoffs out of them. And these guys here, those are your standoffs. So I need 2 of those. And I'll just screw those into those extra mounting holes. I have a handy nut driver for tightening these guys up, but don't worry if you don't have one. You can just use a pair of pliers just to give them just a quick nick. Again, be careful if you're using pliers because it's very easy to over tighten them, and if you over tighten them you might shear them off. So again, remember, nothing needs to be tight inside a computer. If you're having to force it, something's wrong. Back it out and just try again. Now we're ready to drop our motherboard in for real. So I'm going to pull these wires out of the way. I'm going to guide my motherboard in and guide it around the wires that are in the way and line it up with that rear I/O shield. And if you've got to lay it down on the bottom, don't be afraid to do that. We can just nudge this around until it's in the right place. There are 2 candidates for screwing in your motherboard. Some cases use metric standoffs and some of them use imperial standoffs. The only real way to know is to test it and find out. So have a dig through the screws that came with your case and look for one of them with the coarse thread and one of them with the very fine thread. So let's try the coarse threaded screw on a spare standoff and see if it fits. That does not fit at all. However, the fine threaded one, that goes in just fine. So I have metric standoffs on this GameMax case. So I need 6, 7, 8 metric screws. And I'll start off with the screw in the center of the motherboard. So I've got to press the motherboard toward the back of the case, pop a screw in there, and just put him into place. Like with the power supply, I haven't tightened that screw. I've just left it slightly loose so the motherboard can still tilt and shift as required. And now we'll get another screw up in the top corner. And once you've got 2 screws in, you'll find that you don't need to hold the motherboard and nudge it around with one hand. So now we can just loose fit all the other screws as well. And now all my screws are loosely fitted. Once again, I can give that motherboard just one last nudge just to make sure that it's seated correctly. And now I'll hold it firm and just nick up a couple of those screws. Okay, now our motherboard is secure in place, we can start connecting stuff up to it. So I'm going to start off up in the top corner here. I'm just going to reroute this fan cable around a little bit. We'll pull all of these back and tidy them up afterwards, but first of all we just want to get everything connected. So I'll plug in my CPU power connector up in the top corner. Then we'll get our ATX power connector into place. And one thing I've noticed is that the way that this is arranged is that I have to do a lot of twisting to get that in alignment. What I'm actually going to do is put the case upright and just turn this cable over entirely so it's in the right orientation. That way, when I plug it in, it'll be a nice clean loop instead of having a horrid twist in it. That's more like it. Now I can just turn that over backwards and in it goes. This is a heavy connector, this guy, so watch out for it. I'm just going to gently shimmy it down. I've got 2 supports for my motherboard right there and there, so I don't need to worry too much about this. However, this section of the motherboard is often unsupported, so consider getting your fingers under the edge of the motherboard to stop it bending as you press this guy in. And you might not get a satisfying click out of it either. So if you're not sure, just have a feel for the locking connector and just see if you can squeeze that open and shut. If the locking connector is pivoting open and shut, that means it's in position. If it's completely rigid like that, it means it hasn't locked into place yet. This is going to plug into our graphics card. We don't need that quite yet. So now it's time to do all of our front panel connectors, which is all these noodly guys here. So the noodly boys are all labelled. This one's hard drive LED, and it's got a plus with a minus underneath it. So the black wire is the positive and the grey wire is the negative. On your case it might differ, however on the GameMax Kamikaze that's what we've got. And if we have a look on our motherboard here, there's little tiny writing along the motherboard that shows you what plugs in where. If you can't see that writing, refer to your motherboard's manual because there'll be a copy of all of the pinouts for all of these headers within that manual. So I'm going to plug these in. This is loosely standardized, so in the vast majority of cases you can follow the same guideline that I'll be using, which is our hard drive LED goes in the bottom corner. Next to that goes our reset switch. Then above the reset switch, we do the power switch. And then finally, we've got the power LEDs. Now these guys are commonly split. So we've got the negative next to the bundle and the positive in the very top corner. And just like that. Those are all our connectors done up. Optionally, you'll probably find that your case comes with a little beep speaker as well, which is this fella here. This is the system speaker, and this guy is only useful when performing diagnostics on your computer. When the computer switches on, it'll give one beep just to say that the computer has booted. However, for general use, you'll never hear anything from this guy. It's up to you whether you put it in or not. I generally leave it out of most builds, and I only connect up one of these speakers if there's a problem with the computer and I need to hear the beep codes from it. But if you do want to connect it up, that guy just plugs in over here. And like everything else, the positive connection goes toward the back of the case, which is in this direction here. Next to our front panel, we have our USB 3.0 header, and that's what this guy plugs into. This is a big, brutal connector, this one, so don't be afraid if you have some trouble with him. You won't be able to do very sharp turns with it, so I suggest trying to make a big, sweeping curve and just plug that in on top of everything. Now this guy here, this is our HD audio connector, and he actually plugs in all the way in the back corner. So really, he doesn't need to come out of this hole at all. He could be coming out over here and be out of the way of this bundle. So we're going to back away and pull him out and reorient him. Now he's much easier to route. This guy's got a missing pin, so it's quite easy to get in the right way out. And the same missing pin applies to the USB 2 connector, which I'll plug into a USB 2 header that's down here as well. And it's getting kind of cramped down here, but thankfully that one is the last one. There we go. Right, now I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to pull back all the slack on these noodly wires here. The USB 3 cable, as I mentioned, this guy can't do sharp turns, so I'm going to leave that as is. But these guys we can pull back. So now I'll also pull back these wires up in the corner here, and I'll just hold them down reasonably tightly, but not too tightly. Just take up the slack in those, just so they're sitting comfortably, but they're not strained. And I'm just going to hold them in place with my left hand underneath the computer. Now, having turned the whole computer over, I'm just going to keep them pinned with one finger And I'm going to grab one of the zip ties that came with the case, and we're going to zip tie these guys in place. There we go. Okay, so now, as you can see, the main interior of the case, which is just waiting for that graphics card, is starting to look pretty tasty. But what I want to do now is deal with this bit here. So our front fans here, we've got a lot of noodly wires hanging around. These guys up here is just a bit of a twist and a bundled twist that I don't like. That's going to be on show. So we're going to see if we can straighten this lot out. What I want to do firstly is just make sure that all of these wires are tucked behind the main fans. And tuck all those back, and then we're going to turn the case over and pull them all taut around the back.
Cable tidying is a dark art that requires a lot of time and patience to get perfect, and is especially complicated when RGB is involved. Keep in mind that it's optional and you can just flatten all of this behind the rear panel, but I always recommend giving it a try. I'll start by tying back the CPU and ATX power cables, and then unraveling the front panel loom. I'll need to disconnect some of these wires to reorder them, which is always a chore as you'll find yourself doing the same bits over and over until you get a layout that works. Thinner wires are easier to route and tie up excess, so separating them out will reduce the clutter. For the Aurora Sync hub, pull out all the connections and untangle the crossed wires. Then sort them into RGB, fan and front panel looms and tie them back separately. This will leave the hub itself nice and open, making it easier to plug things in.
Okay, right. I've just spent a lot of time reordering and rerouting all of these noodly wires around the back. I've completely stripped back all of the RGB wires and all of the fan wires, reordered them, tied them back into bundles and sorted them all out, and then plugged them back in again. As you can see, we've still got a bit of a rat's nest here, but it's now ordered chaos at least. We've got a little bundle for our RGB cables, we've got a bundle for our fan cables, got a bundle for our front panel cables, and so on. So there's actually logic in the madness now. And now this looks a lot more under control, but more importantly, when I turn the computer over, the inside is now more or less mint. All we've got to do is find a home for our graphics card here, and then we'll basically be done. So to prepare for our graphics card, you want to undo the 2 screws securing this top plate in place, which I've already removed, and then take out 2 of the blanking plates, which I've already removed the screws for as well, just to speed things up a bit. And now we've got plenty of room to slot in our graphics card. Make sure the locking lever on your motherboard is open, and then you can drop your graphics card into place. Right, that's all the hardware in this computer. Let's put on the side panels and make sure that it all starts and runs. A little bit of multi-surface furniture polish is perfect, just for taking off any finger marks that you've put onto your tempered glass. And it also leaves an anti-static layer that'll help reject more fingerprints and dust as well. Now, for your first turn on setup, you're going to want to make sure you've got a monitor, keyboard and mouse connected. However, for the sake of cinematography here, I've just plugged in a power cable at the back and we're going to hit the power switch. And as you can see, the entire case is just immediately brought to life by all these RGB fans. And now we can use the fan switch up top to set the case fans onto off speed, where they are at the moment. Low speed, just for some standard airflow, just for a little bit of a breeze through the entire case. This is ideal for most general purpose applications. Or if we need to do some intense gaming where things are warming up a bit, or if it's the middle of summer, we can stick those guys onto high speed and they will start blowing as much as they can to cycle all that air through the case. and you'll get a considerable amount of through flow through the entire system this way. The LED button can be used to cycle through the various effects on the fans, and there's a huge selection to go through. I'm not going to go through all of them on camera here, but if you do buy one of these cases, I absolutely invite you to have a play, because there's a huge selection to enjoy. And remember, any other ring LEDs that you connect to these or LED strips will also receive the same effect, all of them synchronized. And of course, there are static colors as well, if that's your jam. Personally for me, I really like that cycling rainbow effect. I'm going to go all the way around until I find that again. And in the dark, it's absolutely vibrant with color. I wish I had the cameras to do that justice, but hopefully this is close enough.
The Kamikaze Pro comes in at around £60, which would be about right for a tempered glass Micro ATX chassis on a normal day, but with the addition of the RGB controller and 4 RGB fans pre-fitted, this is an excellent value for money chassis. Thank you very much to GameMax for supplying this one, and check out our upcoming video on the Iceberg 120mm AIO water cooler that we've got fitted to it here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.